If you guys tuned in last week, you were able to learn about some of Florida's important native reptiles. But today, I'm going to be talking about some invasive reptiles that we have. I, like many of my colleagues, really love Florida's biodiversity. For example, our iconic American alligator, as you see here, which is one that I photographed in Big Cypress. But part of, though, defending our native wildlife is battling this problem of introduced species that were brought into Florida from other parts of the world. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Everglades, I think that this is a very fitting quote to start out with, having just celebrated Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's birthday this past week on Everglades Day. The Everglades, or River of Grass as it's called, is one of the most important wetlands in the world. It provides fresh water to over 1 million individuals, and it's also home to a diversity of wildlife. It's really rich in biodiversity. There's a lot of different plants and animals living and interacting together. But I think that what this quote exemplifies is that we all have a responsibility to uphold, and we can all play a part in protecting our planet's natural resources, like the Everglades. Right now, we have one of the biggest hydrologic restoration projects going on in the Everglades to restore it to a more natural state. But invasive species being introduced to this system that's already functioning as it knows how to and has known for many, many years, really just complicates and slows down that restoration process. So next slide, please. I should define an invasive species for those of you who are unfamiliar. What is an invasive species? Really, that's any living plant, animal, bacteria, any living thing that's been introduced into a new environment from somewhere else in the world, and that is actually causing harm to human health, the economy, or the environment. And I'll also add to that definition that it must also be able to adapt quickly and reproduce quickly in this new environment in order to be successful. So if we actually look at what you're seeing here, this figure, which is showing Florida's growth over time in these introductions. So on the blue bars, what you're seeing are introduced reptiles and amphibians by decade. So you can really see this drastic increase over the last couple of decades. And then what you're seeing with those orange bars is from those introductions, which of those species are actually becoming established. And right now in Florida, we have current research shows at least 63 established species of reptiles and amphibians in Florida. And that's actually more non-native reptiles and amphibians than anywhere else in the world. So Florida is really a hot spot for these invasive species. You can see just one of those examples on the top right corner. That's an Argentine black and white tegu, and it's actually stealing an alligator egg from a nest. That's a trail camera photo that we have from our research efforts. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those guys later on. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is just to show you a very small sample of some of these exotic species that you'll find in Florida. Some of them have been introduced intentionally, some have accidentally escaped from captivity, but a lot of them were introduced through the pet trade. Early species like the brown anoles that you see that are very common were brought over on cargo ships. But now with a thriving pet trade, that's one of the things that makes Florida such a hot spot for invasive species, that we have these major ports of entry, a lot of airports, docks for boats and vessels to come in, and a thriving pet trade. So all of these species are able to be brought in very easily. And then because of our subtropical climate, it's very easy for them to actually become established. A lot of the conditions are similar, or at least they're able to adapt to the conditions that are similar to their native range. Excuse me. And I want to make the point that not all exotic species are invasive. Current research actually shows that between 4 and 19% of introduced species in the United States do become established, but Florida is one of those hotspots. So for today, before we get into your questions, because that's really what this is all about, right? I want to help you guys learn what you're here to learn. So Before we get into that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of biology and background about two invasive reptiles that we're studying, and that's these two right here in the center that you can see. On the left in the center, you can see the Argentine black and white tegu, and on the right is the Nile monitor lizard, both of which can be found in Florida. So next slide, please. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but really what I just wanted to point out are some of the key aspects of these lizards' biology that makes them such successful invaders and also a large threat to our Florida's biodiversity. So starting out, this is the Argentine black and white tegu, native to South America. It's actually found in several breeding populations now in Florida, introduced through the pet trade, has escaped into the wild. And now we're finding them, as you saw from that photo earlier, they've been documented eating alligator and turtle eggs. They're also seen near where there could be protected crocodile nesting habitat. They've been found in Central Florida eating gopher tortoise hatchlings. And what we're really seeing here is a very direct threat to some of Florida's not only just biodiverse living things, but a number of species that are protected and imperiled. They're in decline. So that's really a problem. And another thing about their biology that makes them such a big threat is that they can grow much larger than a lot of our native wildlife, our native lizards in particular. These guys can grow upwards of 4 feet, some reports up to 5 feet long, and that's massive. They are very long lived. They can grow up to or live for up to 20 years. And they're also really adaptable. They can live in a variety of environments. They're ground dwelling primarily. They live on the ground and they also dig burrows. So they're able to survive some of the colder months in Florida by burrowing underground when the temperatures drop, because these are ectotherms. Their temperature is the same as their surroundings. So that is one thing that really enables them to potentially spread to new areas and even potentially farther north. Now they've been sighted as far north as Georgia. And they're omnivorous, so they eat a lot of different things. They'll eat both plants and animals, including anything from fruits, insects, to reptiles, small mammals, and especially eggs. They prefer eggs. So as you see on the bottom left, these are just some examples of some of the native wildlife that they're a threat to. For example, the American alligator, we've seen them eating their eggs. Gopher tortoises as well. American crocodiles, they've been found near important nesting habitat. And then the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, which is a really small bird that nests just inches off of the ground. And currently where a lot of these lizards are being trapped is just miles from some of the last remaining breeding grounds for the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. Next slide, please. And so this is another example of one of the species that we're studying, and that's the Nile monitor lizard. So these guys you'll find hanging out around canals. They're a lot more localized than the tegus, meaning that they're really only found in a specific area. But what we're trying to learn is just get a better sense of what their population looks like. There is a breeding population in West Palm Beach, Florida, and also in Lee County, Florida. And these guys, in their native range, which is sub-Saharan Africa, they are actually found eating crocodile eggs. That's one of their main diet items. So that's a huge threat to our American crocodile population here in Florida. And also the largest population of Nile monitors in Florida has been found right within the state's largest population of burrowing owls. And they've been found to eat burrowing owl eggs as well. So these guys are much more carnivorous. They're actually going to mainly eat animals, and they're semi-aquatic. So they travel really well over land and water. They're really strong swimmers. They can climb. These are all things that are a big concern for us. So what we're doing right now, one way, as I mentioned earlier, that you all can help protect the Everglades is we're trying to engage just everyday citizens like yourselves to help be on the lookout for species like tegus and monitors that you might find in your very own backyards. Now, for those of you who are outside of Florida, maybe you can't look for these guys, but how can you help? Well, you can help educate. You can tell tell your friends about these issues, and also be a responsible pet owner, because a lot of these animals were brought in initially as pets. Do your research. Learn what responsibility you're taking on before you buy an animal, especially one like this that can grow up to 6 or 7 feet long. So know what you're getting yourself into, and if you are in Florida, you can directly help biologists by reporting sightings to this hotline called 1-888 I've Got One, or you can go on to I'veGotOne.org, and if you take a photo of what you see, upload it there, and researchers and experts will help you identify what it is that you're seeing, even if you're not sure. That's a really great way to be a biologist in your very own backyard and help us figure out where these guys are and prevent them from getting into our natural areas and sensitive ecosystems like the Everglades. So with that, I think I'm going to open it up now to questions and find out what you guys want to know more about.
Hey, Justin, thank you so much. Our first question comes from Rafa, who's 12 years old, and he wants to know, what is an exotic animal, and is exotic and invasive the same thing?
That's a great question. So I'll answer the second part first. No, exotic and invasive are not the same thing. What an exotic animal is that means that's an animal that was brought somewhere from another part of the world and has been introduced outside of where it's naturally occurring. And an invasive species, how that differs is that's actually when you have an exotic species brought in from somewhere else in the world and introduced into a new ecosystem, like in Florida, then it starts to cause harm to the environment, the economy, and human health potentially by maybe even spreading disease or things like that. So that's really what makes an exotic species different from an invasive species, and not all exotic species do become invasive. It really takes, like I said earlier, those kind of key biology characteristics that they can reproduce really quickly and that they're adaptable to a new environment.
Daniel asks, how do lizards get there in the first place to the point where they would be considered invasive?
Good question, Daniel. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these lizards have been introduced through the pet trade. So people are bringing them in on ships, on planes, to be sold as pets. And a lot of them are legal, some not so much. Like the Nile monitor actually is considered a conditional species. So you're not allowed to own it without a permit in the state of Florida. So a lot of these lizards are coming in that way. Some of them, like I said, the earlier lizards like the brown anoles came over on cargo from ships accidentally. So when you have this inflow of animals, they can either escape. We have occasional hurricanes that destroy their enclosures. We also just, if there are a large number of them, it's just a matter of time until one gets out into the wild. And so if you do have a really adaptable species that's able to have a broad diet and reproduce very quickly, then it's going to establish very quickly. So that's how the numbers really explode. And the other thing to take into account is that there's no system of checks and balances, right? So like in their native range where they are, you have natural predators and things that know to eat them. Whereas here in Florida, if one of these lizards is introduced, it's going to take time for some of the predators to figure out exactly what it is, and they might not target that. So there's not a system of checks and balances in place to help control it, and then the population explodes very quickly.
Tim wants to know, is there ever a situation where an invasive species can be a good thing? For example, biodiversity.
Typically, when we use the term invasive species, we're referring to it being an issue, right? So I can't think of an example off the top of my head where an invasive species is a good thing because of the connotation that comes with that, where invasive means that basically it's damaging the natural biodiversity that's there. While you might perceive the idea of having more biodiversity per se by having another species introduced, you're actually hurting that balance that's there in the ecosystem. So introducing another animal doesn't necessarily mean higher biodiversity, It's actually like if it were to target something like a top predator, the American alligator, for example, which tegus, we know, eat their eggs. We've seen before by nearly hunting alligators to extinction years ago that once that species disappears, a number of other species disappear as well. So they're what's called a keystone species. They help keep everything else in check, like the wading birds and fish populations. So introducing an invasive species is really only going to cause harm to that environment.
Emma wants to know, do you own any lizards?
I do own one lizard, actually. I own a veiled chameleon, which is another exotic species here in Florida, but I keep him primarily for educational purposes to show people that, hey, this is a really beautiful lizard, but I'm keeping him responsibly. And that's actually a species where people have introduced them in small pockets throughout South Florida intentionally because they want to have a free pool of these animals to take from and sell as pets. So they are another exotic species in Florida. I have just the chameleon and that's it. But at work, we also have some outreach animals that we use. For example, we have a tegu that was captured from the wild that we now use to show people this is what a tegu looks like and this is what you can look out for in your own backyard.
So quick follow-up question. Justin wants to know, what's your lizard's name?
My chameleon's name is Albert. I call him Al for short.
All right, Martin asks, how big do lizards grow?
So that really depends on the species. The lizards that I'm talking about today are some of the largest lizards in the world. Actually, Nile monitors are one of the largest lizards in Africa. So these are really large lizards, especially compared to our native species. So the largest lizard that we have in Florida is nowhere near the size of these. You're talking about 3 to 4 feet longer than what our native lizards might grow to. So it really depends on the species, but the two that I'm mentioning, the Argentine black and white tegu can grow up to about 4 feet long, and Nile monitors can grow up to 6, 7 feet long, depending on the conditions. And that's not always true depending on how and what they're eating. So conditions in captivity, what you read on Google, if you were to search how big these guys can grow, might be very different from what they are in the wild. It just depends on available resources.
Stephanie asks, are many of the Caribbean lizard species mostly introduced by hurricanes versus humans?
Good question. I wouldn't say that mostly they're introduced by hurricanes. As the theory goes, with things like Burmese pythons, those were actually introduced during Hurricane Andrew, where it destroyed some enclosures. I can't say with confidence whether hurricanes are introducing them more than humans. I do believe that most humans are the cause of these introductions. Whereas hurricanes, they do cause a lot of harm and destroy these enclosures potentially. But that's a good question and one that I'd have to look into a little bit more to get back to you.
Sophia asks, are green anoles invasive?
Green anoles are not invasive. There are some non-native lookalikes. For example, a Puerto Rican anole that actually looks very similar to a green anole. So the really kind of easy way to tell the difference typically is the shape and color of their dewlap, which is that thing that extends from their neck. They'll puff that out. You might see them on the tree with their dewlap extending out. And the green anoles have a very reddish pink dewlap. So those are actually a native species here in Florida, a beautiful species that I always enjoy seeing when I'm out doing field work. And there's actually been some studies to show that they've been affected by the non-native brown anoles that have come in and taken and filled a niche, meaning basically their role and place in the ecosystem, and have started to cause behavioral changes and things like that to the native green anoles.
Maya asks, how many lizards do you typically trap in the Everglades each year?
So that's a number that's always changing. We do have a trap line in the southern glades, which is targeting the Argentine black and white tegus. So that's to trap and remove tegus. And I think right now we're in a very difficult situation now because we're not currently doing any field work given the status of this virus. But typically we'll trap over 1,000 as of last year, just tegus alone. So just to give you some perspective of that number, but that number is always changing and it depends on how much effort and the number of traps that are being put into it.
Tati asks, are there any native lizards in Florida?
Yes, there are native lizards in Florida. In fact, you'll have to check me on this one, but I do think that there are 16 species of native lizards in Florida. And to compare that to the number of non-native species, that would be over 50 more on top of that, just non-native species of lizards. But yeah, we do have native species of lizards in Florida. For example, that green anole that I mentioned is one, a very beautiful small lizards that you'll find. And then one of the larger lizards is the eastern glass lizard, which actually is a legless lizard. You might think it's a snake when you first see it, but it's actually a lizard without legs. Pretty cool. So we have some really unique native lizards here in Florida.
Noah asks, how do you deal with the moral side of invasive species removal? Issues with people that think they deserve to stay?
That's a great question, Noah. So what I like to tell people when I hear questions like that is what we have to look at is how much valuable information we're gaining from a scientific perspective. So while this is an incredibly difficult conservation issue where you do have people that want them here and that are continuing to fight for keeping them around, we have to show them what direct threats they have to our native wildlife and remind them that we're learning really important things about their biology. For example, how many eggs do they lay? What are they eating? These are the types of questions that we don't always have the opportunity to answer for species like the tegus and monitors and pythons in their native range. So we're getting a lot of really important scientific information out of it, and there's still a lot of questions that remain to be answered. So that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that there's a lot to learn from this.
Kendall asks, how long do lizards live for?
Great question, Kendall. So some lizards live very long, some don't live very long. For example, the chameleon that I own, they typically live, depending on the conditions, they can only live maybe 5 years. But then you have a monitor or tegu that can live upwards of 20 years. And again, that's going to vary between captivity and in the wild. But some of these can live a very long time.
Sam asks, are other countries having problems with any species introduced that are far from the US, that are from the US?
That are from the US. Yes, there are other countries that are having problems with invasive species that are introduced. I wouldn't be the best person to ask about those because our research focuses mostly in Florida, but I'm sure that you could do a bit of research to find that out for sure.
Bruce wants to know, would a Komodo dragon be able to survive in the Everglades if released?
Would a Komodo dragon be able to survive? I can't say for sure. We luckily haven't had one that I'm aware of that's been introduced. We hope to keep it that way, but it's possible, right? So it just depends on their adaptability once they're introduced into that new environment. They are a predator, so I'd imagine that there's a lot of prey for them to eat, but we really don't know, and hopefully would like to keep it that way, that we don't have Komodo dragons in Florida.
Liam wants to know, am I going crazy or have I seen a green anole slowly turn brown when it gets scared?
You are not going crazy. Actually, green anoles can change colors, not so much as rapidly as a chameleon per se, but they can adapt to the substrate that they're on and transition between brown and green. It's a pretty cool adaptation to prevent being seen from predators.
Okay, everybody. Well, we want to thank you for joining us on our call today. to learn all about invasive lizards within the state of Florida. And we have to actually thank Justin Dalaba very much for taking the time to answer your questions from the Croc Docs and the University of Florida's IFAS Research Education Center in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Once again, our Friday Q&As with the scientists take place at 3 p.m. weekly, Eastern Standard Time. And as part of this collaboration between scientists in every Florida school and the Community Scholars Initiative, we'd like to thank you